My name is Kayla Chorley, and I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm a Canadian certified counselor and counseling therapist from Edmonton, Alberta. I own my own private practice called Pineapple Therapy, and it specializes in the area of anxiety. So I work with a lot of adolescent and young adult clients, just like yourself, who may be watching this video. And this is why I'm really excited to talk about anxiety as a topic, because I think it is something that we need to understand a bit more. It's totally a buzzword right now, and a lot of us use it in our day-to-day language. So I think it's helpful to understand what we mean when we're saying that. In terms of my experience, I've worked in a school system prior to becoming a counselor, so I've worked extensively in the classroom as well as in the counseling setting with anxiety and how it might show up. And as well, I have my own personal experience with anxiety that has led me sort of on this path of supporting others who also experience anxiety.
Thank you very much, Kayla, for that. I appreciate you joining us on this show today. Like our viewers would benefit from a lot of the conversation we're going to have. And if we can help somebody, one person, I'm happy about it. You know?
Me too. I'm excited. Thank you for having me.
For sure. So how would you consider perfectionism associated with anxiety?
So when it comes to perfectionism, the term itself, again, is such a popular term now. We use it, I'm sure, regularly, just like we do with anxiety, right? It comes up in our common language these days. So if we had to define perfectionism, it's like a compulsive and irrational desire to be perfect. So essentially, it feels like there are only two options: to be totally perfect or to be a total failure. So it really feels like it's all or nothing in a sense. And research actually indicates that there's an epidemic of dysfunctional perfectionism among younger people, so adolescents included. And they say about 1 in 4 adolescents will struggle with perfectionism at some time in their life. And so it's kind of an interesting thing because perfectionism can promote anxiety. But we often think initially that if we show up perfectly in everything we do, that it will decrease our anxiety. Because it's like, well, if I show up perfectly, then I don't have to worry about those worst case scenarios because I mean, I'm crushing it. There's no need to worry about those things. But actually trying to show up perfectly in itself promotes anxiety. So it kind of is this cycle that we get into where they promote each other essentially. And this can be kind of a challenging dynamic for a lot of people. You know, perfectionism actually can be really challenging and can lead to some pretty serious things. So we tend to see that perfectionism increases a risk for self-harm and suicidal ideation. So I just want to put it out there. If anyone watching these videos is experiencing those things, please know that you're not alone in that experience. And I do encourage you to seek mental health support as soon as you can.
What are the dimensions of perfectionism?
There's what we call self-oriented. And this really comes back to expectations we have of ourselves. So this could be some internal pressures that we put on ourselves to perform perfectly. I have this expectation of myself that I will get 100% on every exam for the entire year. That could be an internal experience that I am now placing on myself. We also have what we call other-oriented. So there's two ways this can show up. The first is we might have really high expectations. We might expect perfection from others. So Addie, I heard you speak of your players, your soccer players. This might be an example of other-oriented perfectionism, we expect others to show up perfectly.
Mhm.
And so we might get really upset, or maybe previously you did, if one of your players made a mistake, right? Or if someone in our lives makes a mistake, we can be pretty upset by that. That's that other oriented kind of perfectionism. And then the last piece is the socially prescribed. So this is the belief that we feel others have high expectations of us to be perfect. So believing that we have to behave perfectly because others are now thinking that we have to be perfect. So an example would be that if people around me expected me to be great at everything I do, that would be an example of socially prescribed perfectionism.
I like that. I actually never knew. I never knew that. So that's good that you touched on that.
Mm-hmm.
So what I tell my players, and especially my son, is that you have to demand more from yourself than the world demands from you. Where it has to be perfect, it has to be win or go home type of mentality. So if you're able to put if you're able to expect more from yourself than everybody else expects from you, then the world's expectation of you won't matter because you already expect more from yourself. What do you feel about that?
Oh man. Well, I think we always want to have expectations of ourselves. That's an important piece always, right? And I think maybe once I explain these two differences, maybe this will provide you with some clarity in that. But the idea is, with striving for excellence, and I hear this is kind of what you're preaching, we're not looking for perfectionism, so to speak. That's not what we're looking for. We don't want you to show up perfectly, because that in itself is impossible. We will never show up perfectly, no matter how hard we try.
I agree.
And if we have that mindset, again, it comes back to that dichotomy of either we're a total failure or we are totally perfect. And to live in those standards is impossible. So striving for excellence, and I hear this is what you're kind of pushing for, is we're not looking for perfectionism. We don't want you to show up perfectly, but we do want you to have expectations of yourself, and we do want you to think of achievement as something that is possible. So it's a little bit more of a balanced perspective. It's no longer that dichotomy of either or. There's a multitude of possibilities, and depending on how we look at it, we can still find success in what we do. And we can also be challenged by kind of pushing that bar for ourselves to do things that are, for lack of better words, that do push us.
Okay. Now, speaking from a coach's perspective again, when does it become problematic for let's say coaches who do suffer from somewhat of anxiety, but they're pushing it onto their athletes? So because they want everything to be perfect, they're not really giving their athletes a chance to breathe. Everything is a problem. Why didn't you do it that way? How do you, because there's quite a few coaches that do coach like that. How would you know the difference if it's pushing them to strive for excellence, or just plain old, you're pushing your anxiety onto me?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I imagine there's some anxiety if someone was coming up to me and being like, you're always doing everything wrong. I feel like I'd feel a little bit anxious there too. What we can really look at is what's driving the behavior. So when we think of perfectionism, it's often fear-based. So we are trying to show up perfectly because we're really afraid of failure. We don't want others to see us as a failure. We don't want to see ourselves as a failure. So we are trying everything we can to avoid being a failure. And this is why we feel we have to show up perfectly in whatever space we're in, whether it's coaching or somewhere else, because we don't want to fail. Whereas striving for excellence then is driven by a desire to be successful and to achieve. So it's very different. If we look at the two, if it's driven by fear, if it's a fear-based response, then we might be dealing more with perfectionism than the striving for excellence.
Okay. Okay. I like that. So perfectionism, not so good. Striving for excellence, great.
Well, and this is it too, right? Because we know perfectionism is impossible. We're never going to be perfect. We are essentially setting ourselves up for failure if we're trying to achieve perfectionism. But if we strive for excellence, we still have this expectation of ourselves that we're going to achieve, we're going to strive to do well, but it's much more realistic and achievable. So this is where we want to be. This is the headspace, the mindset that we're hoping to shift people into when they're dealing with perfectionism.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I find a lot of people are getting away from the mantra of practice makes perfect. Practice makes perfect. You don't hear a lot of people saying that anymore. So, which I definitely appreciate, because a lot of people, they feel like, oh, I gotta practice to make it perfect, which perfection, like you said, is impossible, right? So
100%. And if we promote perfection, you can imagine how devastating it is when we don't show up perfectly. This can feel like life or death for some people. And this is why we see an increase in self-harm and suicidal ideation in these situations. It can feel like the world is coming to an end if we don't perform perfectly. And, we often see this with young adults and adolescents. Will they'll say, well, what's the point of trying? I'm not going to do well, or I'm not going to perform as well as I should. That in itself is because it's a fear-based response. We already are assuming we're going to fail, so what's the point, right? And again, we make our world real small with that, because then we stop doing things that might challenge us, or we might not show perfectly up in. So we just got to be cautious of that for sure.
Okay. What can be done to reduce perfectionism?
It's a great question. Well, first of all, there's kind of several things. The first piece is shifting our mindset from perfectionism to striving for excellence. And we can do that by simply showing up as good enough. We do not have to be perfect. Good enough is good enough. So adapting that mindset of, I'm just going to show up as good enough is a huge piece. But the other second really big piece here is self-compassion. Self-compassion is really helpful when it comes to breaking that cycle of perfectionism. For a lot of us, we feel like we will only be motivated to get things done if we use that tough love, right? If we're kind of hard on ourselves and we're like in our heads like, Kayla, you better do this or else, we feel like that's the only way to motivate ourselves. But that's not actually true. So I always like to use the example of like a loving, caring teacher or a mentor in our lives. Maybe it's a coach like yourself. If we can think of that person that shows up in a warm, gentle manner, they still have expectations of us. That teacher still has expectations. We're going to do the exams. We're going to write the papers. We're going to do our homework. But they're gentle as they encourage us to do those things. And we can be that way towards ourselves as well. It takes practice. It takes some unlearning, but it is possible to do that. So there's kind of three key pieces or components to self-compassion. And there's Dr. Kristen Neff is wonderful. She's done so much research on self-compassion. And so if you read her work, you'll dive into this a bit more. But the first piece is she talks about this common humanity piece. And this is the reminder that we are all human. all of us, and we are all going to make mistakes. This is just inherent. This is who we are as humans. We are messy and we're all over the place.
We're not perfect.
We're not perfect by any means. No matter what we might tell ourselves, we're not perfect. This is our common humanity. We are all of that. We are all going to make errors. The opposite of that would be isolation, feeling like we are the only one that experiences this. We are the only one that makes mistakes, when in fact we know that's not true. So shifting from that, we're the only one that experiences this, to understanding that we are human and will make mistakes. This is just who we are. Excuse me. The second piece is self-kindness versus self-judgment. And we've talked about this multiple times. It's come up in our conversation multiple times today, Eddie, is this idea of judgment. We tend to be really harsh with ourselves. We tend to judge what we're feeling or thinking and all that good stuff in between. But we want to move away from that self-judgment to that self-kindness piece. So as I mentioned, we can still motivate ourselves, but we can be warm and gentle while we do it. And that's really what we want to focus on. And then the third piece brings us back to the idea of mindfulness over the idea of over-identification with our emotions. So sometimes we can over-identify with our emotion. If we're feeling anxious, if we're feeling sad, it can feel all-consuming. But if we can step back from it and really be in the present moment again with our mindfulness, non-judgmental noticing, that can be a really helpful piece when it comes to self-compassion. So again, self-compassion for a lot of us might feel kind of feely, I don't know how to, touchy-feely. That's the way I'd make. Some people are like, oh, self-compassion. Like, feely. But again, it doesn't mean that we're not going to take ownership of our actions or what we've done or anything like that. It just means that we can be accountable, but holding our mistakes lightly.
Okay. You got to kind of like give yourself a break type of situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're still accountable. We still acknowledge our mistakes, but we're just holding them a little bit more gently.
Now, would you see any outside influences in terms of reducing perfectionism? Like I said before, if coaches or mentors or somebody's putting a lot of pressure on you, you're not necessarily putting it on yourself, but because you respect or you admire this person, you now all of a sudden take on that situation. So removing them from your life or removing them in some aspect, would that also help?
It could, if it gets to that extreme, for sure. That would be an example of what we call socially prescribed. If we're coming back to the dimensions, perfectionism, right? Where it's being placed on us from somebody else that we have to show up perfectly. So if it's an extreme example, absolutely, it might be removing that person from our lives or from our day-to-day experience. What I would say too is understanding how other people approach perfectionism is key here too. If we're noticing other people are placing expectations on us, that might give us an opportunity to acknowledge that those expectations aren't ours and we don't actually have to follow them. So this could be another part of our learning, and sometimes we can identify those in therapy. We'll see, okay, these expectations are coming from me, but these ones are coming from other people, and it's my choice if I want to uphold those or not. Yeah. So that could be part of it as well.
How do you advise people who do have these situations? How do you advise them to approach it with their parents or authority to say, hey, you know what, I can't do this, or I'm not comfortable doing it this way? You know, how would you advise them?
Yeah, well, that's a loaded question, Eddie. I think it would have to, and I know this is kind of a cop-out answer, but it would have to be a very individualized I would have to know the context of the relationships. I'd have to know the family dynamics. There's many other pieces of the puzzle that would have to be known before I could provide advice. But what I would say is, if it feels like there's some challenging relationships because of perfectionism, what I would advise is to seek support, family support. Family therapy is certainly an option in those situations where you need to kind of explore some of those relationships and what's coming up. So that would be, and for lack of not answering the question, but answering the question, I would say, I would say, seek family support with that, because it will impact the family dynamic, and it will be important to see the system as a whole and how that impacts other things. So that would be my advice. I would say if you're living with your parents, it can be challenging because, of course, you are, kind of under their roof, so to speak. And it can be challenging to bring up some of these topics. So family therapy is a great space and a safe space to do some of that work.
Okay. No, I appreciate that answer. I hope that we've been able to help somebody today, or hopefully more. And we've touched on a lot of topics today, and I really appreciate your time, Kayla. You've helped me. You've educated me on a lot of things today just by a conversation. So I definitely appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Eddie. I'm excited to see, and I'm really hopeful that this does impact people as they watch it, and now they have a deeper understanding of anxiety.
Okay. Now, if people wanted to reach you, where can they reach you?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's pineappletherapy.ca. They're welcome to pop on there, and they can connect with me that way, or they can send me an email, Kayla@pineappletherapy.ca, or they can find me on Instagram. pineappletherapyyeg is my handle.
Perfect. I hope a lot of people connect with you. Now, quick question before we go. Is there a certain demographic that you like to deal with, or just general?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I usually work with 14-year-olds and up. So young adults are kind of my jam. I like working with young adults, individuals that are in high school or entering post-secondary or in post-secondary. Love to work with that age group. So if that's you and you're looking for support, I'd be happy to support you. But yeah, that's who I like to work with.
Perfect. I'll definitely be sending some people your way.
Awesome.
Hopefully we can get them situated and good to go.
Awesome. Thanks, Eddie.
Thank you, Kayla. You take care.
Yes, you too. Have a good one.
You too. Bye.